Hello, YouTube. Welcome back to another book review from me, your host, Logan Albright. I've got kind of a twofer for you today because this week I read The Marriage of Heaven and Hell by William Blake, which is very, very short, and not quite as short, but almost, The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis. I'm blocking my own face. There we go. That's better. The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis. I don't know why. I got it into my head that I was in the mood to read some C.S. Lewis, and so I picked this up, and then I thought The Great Divorce is sort of a commentary, a little bit of a reply to The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. Instead of being married, they are divorced. And I like William Blake, so I thought I'd get this too. And this is a little Dover paperback. It's got the original illustrated plates in it, and then it additionally has the text in the back. It's a little easier to read. And it's, sort of a poetic argument there where Blake is expressing his personal philosophy, his romanticism, and a little bit criticizing the traditional religious notions of good and evil, and saying that these things are sort of all part of the world and all part of what makes life necessary. And he describes evil as defined by religion as like active energy, and good is more passive. And so he's like, you need the active and you need the passive. They need to work together. You need people who are ambitious and industrious and create things, and you need people who are more reflective. You need all types of people to make the world. It's a little bit oblique in his description of what his philosophy is. It's a little hard to understand at times, but you get the sense that he is saying that there's a place for everything, and that these all things are necessary to make the world go around, and that religion unnecessarily divides things into good and bad. And he talks about like how in the book of Job, the devil is the tempter, the devil is the one who's testing Job's faith. But in other parts of the Bible, God is the one who's testing people's faith, and so God and the devil are two sides of the same coin. Basically, I think that's basically what he's getting at. And he has a list of the proverbs of hell, which are kind of written like the biblical book of Proverbs, but they're a little bit more puzzling. And he talks about how they need to incorporate paradoxes or contraries, as he calls them, and that contrary things coming together is what makes us think and what makes us progress. And so these are sort of paradoxical, teasing little proverbs of hell that are quite interesting, although not always easy to understand. The one that I like the most says that no bird can soar too high if he soars on his own wings, which I really like and think is a very good point. So I'm a fan of William Blake, and I thought this was a really interesting little book. I'm not going to claim that I fully understood it, but I like that kind of romanticism philosophy. He also talks about Paradise Lost in here, which is one of my favorite books, and how Milton was of the devil's party without realizing it, and how he wrote in fetters when he wrote of angels, but he wrote freely when he wrote of devils because he was a true poet, and he was kind of sympathizing with Lucifer and his desire for freedom and rebellion. And so I like that too. I've always felt that Paradise Lost is a book about where the devil is really the protagonist, and he's really someone who is striving for independence and freedom from just kind of mindless, boring servitude that goes on forever. So I like that kind of stuff, and so I enjoyed this a lot. And then I actually read them in reverse order, but for the sake of argument, let's say then I read The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis is an author that I've always kind of wanted to like, but I've always really struggled to like. I enjoyed the Narnia books when I was young. I haven't really revisited them as an adult, which I probably should do, but he was a member of the Inklings. He was a buddy of Tolkien, who's my favorite guy. And so I'm like, I should appreciate Lewis. I'm sure he's a very smart man. But his more theological texts, I have never particularly found persuasive. And it's interesting because people talk about him as being this great persuader and this like wonderful apologist for Christianity, and someone who's able to, make it seem appealing to the masses and stuff, and really, write very clearly about why the faith is worth defending. And I don't have that feeling about him at all. I read Mere Christianity years ago when I was kind of trying to figure out my own spirituality, and I found it utterly unpersuasive. I found his arguments very shallow, and I feel like he's preaching to the choir. Like he assumes that you basically already agree with him when he starts arguing, and so from that standpoint, if you don't already agree with him, it's hard to get very much out of the argument. This is a problem I have with a lot of like classical philosophers like Plato, is that he has these dialogues where he'll say, well, surely you must agree on this premise. And the person he's dialoguing with says, yes, of course. And then they go on and make a long argument. And I raise my hand and say, but I don't agree. And then the rest of the argument makes no sense if you don't agree with the basic premise. And so that's kind of where I am with Lewis. The Great Divorce was written in 1946. It is a very short novel, although I think calling it a novel is a little bit misleading. It's really a theological allegory. And it's about a man who is on a bus ride from hell to heaven. and he sees what heaven is like and witnesses the people who are on the bus with him interacting with the people who are already in heaven and kind of explaining their different points of view. And his basic idea is that people make their own hell, people create their own suffering, and anyone who wants to give up on things like pride and stubbornness and selfishness and resentment can freely enter heaven and stay there as long as they want, and that the only thing preventing them from doing it is themselves, which I think is an interesting concept. And I think it's very true and very wise to say that people often create their own suffering. There are sometimes exterior circumstances that like disease or things like that, natural disasters that maybe contribute to people suffering against their will. But in a lot of cases, people's own attitude and their own personality will create their own suffering. And he gives a lot of examples of people who are like that, people who won't give up on like trying to make other people feel pity for them, or trying to engender or trying to nurse a resentment for other people, jealousy, things like that. And they won't give it up. And so they're stuck in hell because of that. And hell, in his view, is, just sort of a blandly miserable sort of place. It's not like a realm of eternal torture and hellfire and lake of molten lead or anything like that. It's just kind of, mildly unpleasant. But, I don't really find his argument persuasive when he comes to theology, because while I agree that on earth you make your life what it is by your attitude towards it, it doesn't really apply to theology in my view very well, because first of all, it's not what the Bible says. It always bothers me when people just make up what Christianity says and they say, oh, well, it's probably this. And like, that's not accurate, I mean, I've read the Bible twice, and it doesn't say in the Bible that hell is people making their own lives miserable because they won't give up on resentment and hate. It says if you disobey, if you don't believe in Jesus, you will be cast into a lake of fire. And I recently read and I reviewed on the channel a book by a Catholic bishop from the 19th century who, talks about hell in the most literal terms. And he's very strident in saying, this is what hell is. It actually is torture. It actually is fire. It actually is suffering. That's what the Bible says. And so I feel like you get all of these, modern Christians, or, 20th century Christians in Lewis's case, not super modern anymore, who are like, well, that all sounds a little nasty. So, like, let's just say, when Jesus talks about being cast into a lake of fire, what he really meant is that, you make your own life miserable, or you make your own afterlife miserable, and that you can just give it up and be fine and everything's okay. But that's nowhere in the Bible, so I don't understand where they're getting that from. It sounds like they're just trying to, make up something that sounds nicer to them and that will be more persuasive to people to want to join their religion, rather than actually following what's in the text. And I don't know where you're getting that from. So it's hard to be persuaded by that kind of argument, because it just seems to come out of nowhere. It doesn't seem to be backed by anything. Certainly not the historical tradition of Christianity, certainly not the original religious texts. And so, I don't know. I always have a problem with that. And which, it sounds very nice to say, oh yeah, everybody can get into heaven if only they live a good life and they're nice to people and they don't have all these, negative emotions, then they'll be fine and get into heaven. But that's not what it says. You have to do very specific things to get into heaven. And the Bible has all this stuff about, killing people, stoning people if they disobey the commandments and all that. It's not very nice. It's not very pleasant. So that's probably why I'm not a Christian, is I haven't been able to get past that sort of thing. Also, in The Great Divorce, I feel like Lewis doesn't make a very persuasive case for heaven as a place that sounds nice to be. His version of heaven seems very sterile and kind of bleak. He talks about how the people on the bus from hell are insubstantial, and it hurts them to walk on the grass. The grass kind of stabs them like shards of glass, and they can't really interact with anything. But it's just sort of a vast, featureless plain with a mountain in the background, and all the people that you interact with in heaven seem a little bit unpleasant to me. They seem a little bit, self-satisfied, a little bit smug in their position in heaven. They seem, and there's no compassion either. This is something he addresses in the book. He does do a fairly good job of trying to address some of the criticisms, but I found this one doesn't really work for me, because, the people in heaven are like, oh, come join us, and, let go of your anger and your hatred and your resentment and come join us in heaven. And the people are like, no, I'm not going to, and I'm going to go back to hell and suffer forever. And the people in heaven are like, okay. And then they go off and have a good time. And the narrator says, the protagonist of the book is like, well, isn't it kind of crummy that, like, they don't seem to care about other people's suffering? They're just sort of indifferent to it. They're like, well, we're happy up here in heaven, so everyone else, it's their own fault, and we don't feel bad for them. And the angel to whom he's speaking at the time, he has sort of a angelic guide, which is a little bit analogous to Dante, Virgil's character, being guided through hell. There's clearly an influence from Dante there, and that this kind of being escorted through heaven and being shown around and seeing all the different personality types. But anyway, his guide says, it's George MacDonald, by the way, the fantasy author, which I thought was kind of funny. He says, oh, well, it would be wrong for the miserable, unpleasant people to have the power to make the good, happy, righteous people feel bad. And so they don't have that power. So the good, happy, righteous people are just indifferent to the suffering of everyone else because they don't want to be in their power to make them feel bad about other people not being in heaven. Which, I understand that argument, but it just seems a little callous. It's hard to say that, this is a paradise where everyone's happy if you're just kind of, completely blind to the eternal suffering of everyone else. And I get that in this book, the idea is that they're only suffering because of their own choices and that they can stop at any time. But I guess that's not that easy for some people. And so I don't know. It struck me as a little bit callous and harsh and unpleasant. And the picture that C.S. Lewis paints of heaven is not one that particularly appeals to me or that makes me think I would want to be there. So I kind of struggled with that. It's very short. I feel like it could have gone into more detail. And it basically is just a list of sort of... the other thing that reminds me of Dante is the list of personality types is very clearly people that Lewis has met that he doesn't like. And he's like, oh, and here's this person who's suffering in hell because she's a domineering wife who won't leave her husband alone. Or here's this person who's suffering in hell because he's trying to make everyone else feel guilty and feel sorry for him all the time. That kind of stuff. And so that is very similar to Dante as well. But as a work of apologetics, I feel like you already have to buy in to the whole heaven-hell paradigm. You have to buy into the idea of an eternal judgment, which I have always struggled with. I've always felt is a very unpleasant idea. This idea that you're going to be judged for all your failings and everything, and it's the judgment lasts for eternity. Doesn't seem very fair to me. I never liked it. So you have to buy into all that to really appreciate what Lewis is saying, or else you have to just completely disregard all the other teachings of Christianity and say, oh yeah, it sounds nice that I can just go to heaven if I want to, and that hell is just me being a little bit miserable, and it's not actually being tortured for eternity, and I can leave anytime I want. He says that the door to hell is locked from the inside. So anyone who's inside can unlock it and leave, but you can't get in from the outside. I think you have to already buy into that stuff in order to, and disregard the rest of Christian teaching to really be persuaded by it. As a work of better apologetics, when I was reading a lot of this stuff earlier in my life, I really love G.K. Chesterton's work, Orthodoxy, which is his work. It's his an apologetic work about the Catholic faith and why he's a Catholic and why he thinks other people should be Catholics. I think it's a beautiful book, although I was not persuaded by it and I'm not a Catholic. I thought his arguments were much more solid and much more persuasive, and I thought the writing was much more beautiful and joyful, and he really kind of, you sense the joy with which he holds his faith and his religion, and you sense like it would be nice to join him in that. It would be nice to be part of that joyful company of people who are Catholics together. It sounds so lovely. C.S. Lewis doesn't come across to me as joyful in this. He doesn't come across as, reveling in the beauty and the glory of the Lord. He comes across as a little bit judgmental. And so, I don't know. I didn't find it persuasive. I much prefer Chesterton. If you are someone who is kind of dabbling in the Christian faith and you're looking to be persuaded, you're interested in joining, but you're not quite there yet, I really recommend you read Chesterton. He's so much better than C.S. Lewis, and I don't know why his reputation isn't as high as Lewis is. Maybe Lewis wrote for a little bit more of a popular audience. I don't know, but Chesterton is much better. So that was my thought on The Great Divorce, and my thought on The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, which I preferred to The Great Divorce because Blake is just such a colorful and interesting poet. And even though most of this is written in prose, there's that kind of poetic sensibility is coming through it. I'd be interested to know your thoughts. What do you see in Lewis that I'm missing? Why do other people find him to be such a great communicator and I find him so bland and didactic and a little bit self-important? I'd be interested to know your thoughts on that in the comments. If you enjoyed this review, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, and come back each and every week for more book reviews from me, your host, Logan Albright. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, I'll catch you later.